June 11, 2015. On Twitter Thursday, Paul Triple H Levesque announced the passing of Virgil Dusty Rhodes Runnels Jr. He was 69. Rhodes was one of the most charismatic pro wrestlers in history and among the most popular wrestlers and biggest drawing cards of the 70s and 80s. He was born Virgil Riley Runnels Jr. and took his name from a baseball star of an earlier era. The only details we've heard as of this time is that he had a fall at his house earlier Thursday, his kidneys were shutting down and he started to get dehydrated. Rhodes is generally considered the biggest star in the history of the Florida Regional Territory and booked Jim Crockett promotions in the 80s and WCW in the 90s. He's been working in WWE developmental for years as a promo coach. Rhodes was a college football and baseball player at West Texas State, a contemporary of Bruiser Brody and Terry Funk. He got into pro wrestling after playing semi-pro football. He made his first name in wrestling as a heel, teaming with Dick Murdoch as the Texas Outlaws. The team held numerous championships and had strong runs in a number of territories. Eventually, they went their separate ways. Rhodes had become the top singles heel in the Florida Territory when Eddie Graham sensed the crowd was starting to get with him because of his colorful interviews and mannerisms. Before the turn, Graham tested his theory in a world title match where Rhodes faced then-champion Jack Briscoe, who had been Florida's most popular wrestler for years. He put a spot in where Rhodes delivered his elbow drop and Briscoe, instead of kicking out, put his foot over the ropes. That one move caused the crowd to get behind Rhodes, proving Graham's theory. He then booked an angle where Gary Hart and Pac Song turned on Rhodes in a tag team match. Rhodes became the biggest draw and most popular wrestler in the state with his first run setting box office records in most cities. He became a touring star and was brought into all the big money territories, whether it was the WWF, AWA, Carolinas, Georgia or wherever a main event attraction was needed, while remaining mostly based in Florida. When Georgia Championship Wrestling started getting a national foothold, Rhodes was its top babyface with a feud with Ole Anderson and Ivan Koloff. In 1984, Rhodes moved to the Carolinas to become the booker for Jim Crockett Promotions. This led to a huge increase in business in 1985 and 1986, but things started faltering in 1987 and for a variety of reasons. Between going with a pat hand and repetitive main event finishes, attendance fell while spending increased. Crockett sold the promotion to Turner Broadcasting in 1988 after significant money losses. Rhodes had a falling out quickly with Jim Herd, who was put in charge of WCW. This led to his run as the common man in polka dots with WWF. Some of this was retribution since Rhodes, as booker, was considered Vince McMahon's biggest adversary just a few years earlier in quest for national domination of the business. After being fired by McMahon after a few years as a headline wrestler, Rhodes' active career was over. He went back to WCW, where he performed a number of roles including booking and television announcing. As far as an ability to work and control a crowd as a babyface, Rhodes ranks right up there with anyone at any point in pro wrestling history and was an unquestioned all-time great. June 22, 2015. Dusty Rhodes, a pro wrestler who touched lives of multiple generations of wrestlers and fans as one of its most charismatic stars in history in front of the camera, and who was equally as important behind the camera, passed away on June 11 at an Orlando hospital at the age of 69. Rhodes, born Virgil Riley Runnels Jr., on October 12, 1945, had been ill for some time. He had lost a lot of weight and looked like he had greatly aged in the last few years. While those in wrestling who were close to him said he was on a strict diet for health reasons, many since conceded that it was a cover reason because Rhodes was a proud man who never wanted anyone to look at him like he was ill. However, his death was sudden, shocking, and completely unexpected. He had done some media work on June 8, including promoting a gathering of current and former stars in Tampa as a fundraiser for a wall that would honor the state's rich regional wrestling history. He went to work the next day at the Performance Center in Orlando, doing his usual duties. On June 10, at just before 6 a.m., he was getting up and suddenly got dizzy and collapsed. His wife, Michelle, made a panicked call to 911, and he was rushed to the hospital. According to friends, he did start making a comeback from near death, as he had in thousands of matches during a career as one of the greatest babyface characters in the history of the industry. But he was dehydrated and his kidneys shut down, and he passed away, with his family by his side, the next morning. The next day, his son, Dustin, wrote, "Yesterday, my father passed away with his 4 children, my daughter, and his wife of 38 years by his side. He was our hero and the greatest father in the world. He is the reason I am who I am today. He taught me so many lessons in life. He had one thing that he wanted to be, and that was he wanted to be forever young. Now he is. Now he is dancing with the angels in heaven. He was my mentor, my hero, and a dad that I strive to be like. I love you, Dad. Thank you for all the overwhelming amount of love and support. He would have been on cloud 9 with this. Nearly all of his friends talked with this past week noted that Dusty would have been thrilled with the incredible amount of attention his death garnered. He was lauded by many stars as the most charismatic performer and greatest talker in the history of the industry. While in situations like this people are prone to exaggeration, there is little question he was in the top tier, with very few peers in both categories. Of wrestlers I've witnessed over roughly 45 years covering the business, the most charismatic performers, no particular order, were Rhodes, Bruno Sammartino, Hulk Hogan, Dwayne Johnson, Steve Austin, Antonio Inoki, and Ric Flair. There are few who were at his level on promos, either as a heel or a babyface, and there is nobody today except Dwayne Johnson, or on rare occasions when he's at his best, John Cena, who comes close. That night, he was scheduled to attend the event at the Jewish Community Center in Tampa, which turned into mourning wrestlers and fans doing nothing but tell stories about the biggest wrestling star the state had ever seen. The other irony is it was 36 years for the day of the death of John Wayne, a character who was both Dusty's hero and also the man he patterned himself as a babyface after. Terry Funk, battling pneumonia, arrived in Tampa that afternoon. My phone exploded when I got off the plane, said Funk. J.J. Dillon was also flying in, and noted that when he landed, his phone exploded as well. Immediately, he feared that Pedro Morales, who he knew was in bad health, had passed away. But then as he looked at the texts, he was floored. Dillon assisted Rhodes as a booker in Florida and later for Jim Crockett Promotions, and Rhodes was responsible for giving him his biggest breaks in the industry. I saw it was Dusty, he said. The plane emptied. I was still sitting there in my seat and I didn't know how to process it. Much of his health issues were secretive, causing those who had known him for decades as friends to only speculate. Nobody close to him would confirm anything past he had battled health issues, which was one of the reasons he didn't attend the 50th Cauliflower Alley reunion a few months ago. He had been suffering from phlebitis for some time, dating back to the end of his in-ring career. But the weight loss and his skin color was a concern. It was known that at one point, because he hated to go to the doctors and hospitals, that his family pretty much had an intervention to force him to check himself out. He'd been heavily overweight for decades, and his weight was part of his trademark during the latter stages of his career. The outpouring of emotion spread through the industry in minutes, as Rhodes touched so many people over the last 5 decades in so many different ways. While he'd have loved the media attention, one of the last tweets he made, just 10 days before his death, was kind of ominous, given almost all the major newspapers used a national story that talked about him as being famous for wearing polka dots. So sick of the dancing pic with the dots being put up, he wrote. WTF, 50 years and it's the 1 year 3 months dots on tour. LOL. There are people who remember him as the really overweight guy dancing with Sweet Sapphire with the exaggerated smile in what was his last major run in the WWF. It was from the summer of 1989 until the 1991 Royal Rumble show. While he got a significant push and was very popular, he wasn't the famous Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, any longer. He was something very different. Up until a few months earlier, the key players in the wrestling war were Vince McMahon on one side, and Jim Crockett Jr. and Dusty Rhodes on the other side. Crockett was a reserved businessman whose relationship with Rhodes was somewhat similar to the later Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan pairing. Crockett, on the backs of Rhodes and Ric Flair, built a former Carolina's regional promotion to a national powerhouse. In 1 year behind Rhodes' creative genius, even with his flaws and the later downslide, he was that they went from 800,000 paid spectators in a year to 2 million. There were a lot of major cities where they were dueling evenly with WWF. There were several markets where they were winning, although WWF was clearly well ahead, overall. But a slew of mistakes were made that one could almost write a book on. Rhodes was running through so many ideas in 1986, when the promotion peaked, that he was bound to run dry. The talent, almost an all-star team, was starting to get stale. When Crockett purchased the UWF, that could have brought with it an influx of new talent that could be mixed in, but the UWF talent was mostly buried and squandered, with the exception of Rhodes putting Jim Ross in a key announcing position. Eventually Sting and Rick Steiner were pushed in 1988, but most of the talent was gone quickly and none were put into the top mix. But house show attendance dropped because of repeating the same matches and worse, the same finishes, while expenses got out of control with huge corporate offices in Dallas and the stars using corporate jets to fly from place to place. They signed wrestlers to big money contracts to keep them from leaving. Vince McMahon also had them locked out of major arenas, blocked their first Starrcade pay-per-view from being broadcast on all but 5 mid-sized market local cable systems, which was a huge blow at a time they needed a big money score, and put on a free television special which killed business for their second attempt on pay-per-view, where they also didn't have a strong card, building around a bunkhouse stampede battle royal. In 1987, when they were starting to fall, they were using the jet to go to Greenville, 102 miles away from Charlotte, noted Kevin Sullivan, who worked with Rhodes and J.J. Dillon in creative. At one point, Rhodes was talking about going with Crockett to Hollywood to make movies and sitcoms. Like Hogan with Bischoff, Crockett saw the charm of Rhodes and knew the success he had with Rhodes in growing the business. He figured that as long as he had Rhodes and Flair, business would end up fine. Rhodes would blame the fall on Crockett, since it was his job to handle expenses, but it was also Rhodes' job to keep revenues strong. And a lot of the spending was at Rhodes' behest, although neither saw the iceberg coming. Crockett has since blamed himself, since ultimately, it was his responsibility, which it was, although his brother David blamed the fall on Rhodes. When they bought out Watts, UWF, they didn't learn the same thing Vince didn't learn. They killed the UWF, said Sullivan. It was ego-driven. I think it was Crockett. Crockett had a huge ego. When Jim Crockett Sr. passed away, he left the business to John Ringley, his son-in-law. What does that say when he didn't leave it to his son? Dusty fed into Jim's ego and he gave Dusty full control. They both thought it was never going to end. But by 1988, there were millions in debt after a bad 1987 which saw business fall, particularly in the fourth quarter, and no pay-per-view revenue from Starrcade. Early 1988 was worse. The lone bright spot was the Great American Bash that year on pay-per-view, which did 170,000 buys on pay-per-view with a very limited universe for a Ric Flair vs. Lex Luger match in Baltimore. Rhodes booked a finish that was heavily criticized, but in that instance, worked for business. The Maryland Commission was a stickler on blood, so they worked with the commission on the finish. As silly as this sounds, they allowed Luger to blade but then ordered the match to stop. At the time of the stoppage, Luger had Flair up in the torture rack and seemingly was about to win the title. Luger had very little blood, which didn't help, and with Rhodes as the top star, blood was a huge part of the equation. Fans were used to bloodbaths not being stopped. Still, Flair vs. Luger rematches did great business, and gave the company hope that maybe they wouldn't have to sell. But once that program ran its course, business was back to its previous lower levels. When TBS bought the company, Jim Hurt and Jack Petrick were put in charge. What few knew is that Flair, not Rhodes, was the guy Ted Turner considered the top guy and the one that was key in making the deal. Rhodes and Flair were having problems. Flair was world champion, but he would never win matches and the NWA title looked weaker to fans than the WWF belt, since Hulk Hogan always won. In those days, the value of the world title, or more importantly, who the fan base thought was really the world champion, was a key part of the popularity of the brand. Rhodes was still booking with the mentality of the territorial days with no competition, where the goal was to keep the local star strong by having him get screwed in championship matches. The WWF philosophy was to make the champion look strong, and while he may get screwed in early matches, he wouldn't lose the title and every title program would have a blow-off where the champion vanquished the challenger and moved on to the next challenger. Rhodes and Flair had problems by this point, and Tully Blanchard and Arnold Anderson had already quit and gone to WWF. Rhodes, not knowing how important Flair was in the sale, wanted Flair out. He booked Starrcade 88 for Rick Steiner to beat Flair in 6 minutes in a cage match. The idea was that Steiner, a very good college wrestler at the University of Michigan, would be in a cage with Flair. Either Flair would have to do the job or he'd quit. Hurd figured that he'd quit, and that was exactly what Turner didn't want. Panicked, Hurd called Larry Matuszak, who he knew from the St. Louis office. Matuszak said that the money program was Flair vs. Luger, which had passed its peak, but Flair had yet to win a climactic match. It was still easily the biggest main event the company could put on its biggest show of the year. Matuszak also told Hurd that Flair, after being abused for so long as champion, had to win. Rhodes wasn't used to being overruled. The next thing he did was shoot an angle where the Road Warriors, who he turned heel, put a spike in his eye, which completely violated the standards when it came to graphic violence and foreign objects that Turner had. Rhodes was fired. He tried, with Mike Graham and Gordon Soley, to start a regional promotion in Florida, the first version of Florida Championship Wrestling. But they lost tons of money fast. The days of regional promotions were over, even one that featured Dusty Rhodes in Florida. Rhodes leaving killed the group, and for years, Mike Graham and Soley were very bitter at Rhodes for pulling out. But Rhodes had a lifestyle to live, and there was only one place he could go, the WWF. Although Rhodes was a huge attraction as a special guest in the Northeast for McMahon's father, ever since the wrestling war started, Rhodes had ripped on the younger McMahon. He'd go into new cities where WWF had gotten the jump, produce a great live show, and get on the mic saying his side was going to kick Vince McMahon's ass. In Texas, he'd substitute Fritz von Erich for Vince McMahon. So now he was there, hat in hand. The gimmick was to humiliate him. The old Dusty Rhodes, even though not looking like a matinee idol, still acted like a ladies' man. And with all his charm, and being a true larger-than-life superstar, he pulled it off. Rhodes had super appeal to blacks and would talk about getting him some brown sugar, the idea of having sex with hot young black women. One would think in the South in the 1970s that no white babyface would dare tease the idea of an interracial relationship, let alone a white babyface who almost played black. But Rhodes' appeal cut across all racial lines. He was huge with minorities, and he'd talk about his fans being black, white, green, red, and yellow. So McMahon put him in polka dots, had him dancing, and put a heavy-set 55-year-old black woman as opposed to the hot young women the old Dusty would talk about as his sidekick. They wanted a real-life Aunt Jemima. Terry Garvin, a member of the booking team, remembered a St. Louis wrestling fan that everyone knew and liked named Juanita Wright. She was brought in as his love interest, Sweet Sapphire. But he made it work. While he was nowhere near as effective as he'd have been in a run using his old character, an old, fat but serious bar-fighting ass-kicker, crusher, and bruiser were still packing them in when they were 10 years older than Dusty was at this point. His charisma was such that he still got over. Those close to Wright, who passed away in 1996 at the age of 61, said that she always praised Dusty for treating her well, always being nice to her and getting her over. She knew he could have been very bitter, given the level of star he was, and that her being there in that role was meant for those in power to make fun of him. Still, after a year and a half, Rhodes was stunned when McMahon fired him a few months after having the debuting Undertaker destroy him head up with no gimmicks at the 1990 Survivor Series in a way that nobody had seen Rhodes destroyed before in a head-up fair situation. It was one thing for Dusty Rhodes to be fired for a beef with management. He'd have those things happen before, since he would do things his way, and if the owner of the territory got mad, he was the greatest sports attraction in the world, and there was no shortage of places for him to go. It was quite another to be fired when he was behaving and making the best out of a bad situation. But McMahon was always about youth and looks. Rhodes was old and really heavy. There was no more fun in humiliating him, and he'd already had him put people over everywhere, which he knew, but Rhodes didn't, was on the way out. Sullivan remembered how big Rhodes was during his Florida babyface run from an incident where Rhodes was out late celebrating the night before television. We get to TV and there's no Dusty, and TV started and there's no Dusty, he said. Eddie Graham called his house. He got him on the phone. Eddie had to hold up the taping for 30 minutes. Anybody else, Eddie would have fired on the spot. Even if you were a main eventer on top, you'd have been fired for that. Still, he landed on his feet. After 2 years of declining business since he was fired, WCW brought him back as booker. That was a funny story in itself. I was given word from one of Rhodes' closest friends that he was going back to WCW as a booker. Jim Herd, who ran the company, called me up and said that it wasn't true. There was a several-week period because he still had to work out his final dates with WWF. Evidently, Jack Petrick had hired Rhodes, without telling Herd, who was the guy running the company. On his way out, Rhodes bumped into Sam Mushnick at a show, and Mushnick asked if he was going back to WCW, and Rhodes denied it. A few weeks later, I saw Herd at a show, and he told me that, in fact, it was true, but he just found out about it. Herd and Rhodes continued to have problems, given Herd had fired him as booker once before. Herd then went to Petrick and said that, either he goes or I go. Herd later joked that he never thought for a second he was giving his notice or that the ultimatum wouldn't work, but Petrick chose Rhodes this time. For Rhodes to come back to WCW as booker, the caveat was that he would have to retire from the ring. He had slowed down greatly, and was 45 years old, had bad knees by this point, very limited mobility, and was obviously not in good shape. The feeling was that as long as he wasn't active and so adamant about keeping himself as the aging John Wayne babyface, he'd be effective just concentrating on creative for everyone else. That didn't work out, but there were problems in WCW at that time far deeper than the booking. And he also didn't have the quality of young, fresh prime talent that he had 5 years earlier. Eventually he became Dusty Rhodes, the wacky television announcer. He didn't always get the talent over, but he'd do his catchphrases and comedy. And he was an institution in pro wrestling by that time. Still, it was a tough period. Rhodes still fashioned himself as a creative genius, but he was bounced from creative. Sullivan remembered seeing it really hit hard when WCW hired Bob Mould, an alternative rock legend who was a longtime fan and friends with Gary Juster, for the booking team. What is funny is that so many in creative, including Ryan Ward in NXT, were taught by Rhodes. David Lagana, the head of creative in TNA, also credited Rhodes with helping mentor him in the business. But Rhodes had a strong attitude that not only unless you were a wrestler that you could never book, but he felt that unless you were a wrestler who drew big money, you couldn't know how to book. It was tough for him, said Sullivan. I always had the utmost respect for Dusty. I always wanted to make him feel at ease. I could tell, he felt like Napoleon at this time. Here was a guy who was emperor of the universe, for the NWA, who drew all kinds of money, and they brought in Bob Mould. Bob Mould was a wonderful guy who knew a lot about wrestling and brought a different perspective, a fan's perspective, to creative. But they picked him over Dusty. It was the only time I ever saw Dusty let his emotions get to him when Bob came in the office, and I happened to be there. He said, "What kind of a name is Mould?" And Bob was a sensitive guy and he didn't need that kind of shit. I actually said to Dusty to lay off him. They made the decision there. They gave him, Rhodes, a huge salary to just go home, and it crushed him. But long before any of that, some fans remember him as Dirty Dusty Rhodes, of the Wild Texas Outlaws tag team with Dirty Dick Murdoch. Far more, particularly in Florida, remember him from the mid-70s as the jive-talking larger-than-life babyface who packed arenas weekly in battles with one heel after another, and for his constant quest to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. When I was a kid in the pre-VCR era, my parents knew not to schedule anything at noon on Saturdays, remembered Fox Sports football reporter Alex Merves, who grew up doing a pro wrestling newsletter. That's because championship wrestling from Florida was on television. If we did have to go somewhere, like a mall or the shooting range, I had to find a TV to watch. While different babyfaces in the late 70s and early 80s came and went from the territory, Sweet Brown Sugar, Butch Reed, Mr. Florida Paul Jones, and Eric Embry to name a few, none was bigger than Dusty Rhodes. Kids at the playground would always be giving each other bionic elbows, just like Dusty did on TV, and get into arguments about whether his blood was real or catsup. When my dad started taking me to the matches when I was 7 or 8 years old at the Miami Beach Convention Center, I got the chance to see firsthand just how over Dusty was. My dad was so into it that he almost rushed the ring when Don Morocco led a triple team attack on Dusty. Rhodes' death was talked about this past week on Major League Baseball games, on Inside MMA because of all the tweets by MMA fighters who grew up watching him, on sports shows, and during the boxing broadcast on Spike TV. A commercial for an MMA fight aired all week on AXS with one of the fighters doing the Hard Times promo, and that was a commercial done from a promo in rotation, before Rhodes passed away. In other parts of the country, he was a special attraction, who would come in on occasion and headline big shows, almost like an Andre the Giant, talking people into the seats with taped interviews put into the local programs. With the advent of cable, he grew even bigger. As WTCG, later WTBS and just TBS, grew in exposure, its flagship and highest-rated show was Georgia Championship Wrestling. And its biggest star was Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, with his classic feud with Ole Anderson and Ivan Koloff. A few years later he was the top babyface in front of the cameras, and the architect behind the scenes, for Jim Crockett Promotions as they battled, eventually losing, in a bitter wrestling war with Vince McMahon's WWF led by Hulk Hogan. The battles between Rhodes and Ric Flair, along with the rest of the Four Horsemen, both in the ring and on the mic, became legendary. Business flourished for a few years, but then collapsed, and the company ended up being sold to Turner Broadcasting, which wanted to keep the highly rated programming on the station. Rhodes had his run as the Fat Dancing Man in Polka Dots in the WWF during his last major run as a wrestler, and spent the next quarter-century working for WCW and WWE in a variety of jobs including booker and announcer. In between, he also at times ran his own wrestling school, and tried a few times to run his own promotion. In recent years, he'd worked for WWE in their developmental system, first with FCW and then he moved to Orlando to work at the Performance Center with NXT. He would come in a few days a week to run promo classes, tell stories, and was this charming legend who had frequent problems with management because he was Dusty Rhodes, and he was always going to do things his way. But those close to him say that he had mellowed in recent years, and his confrontations were fewer. It was noted that there were slights people saw when the Performance Center opened, Such as a guy recruited from Barnum and Bailey Circus got a nice office and he got nothing at first, that the old Dusty would have pitched a fit over. He was more content to be happy and be with his kids, both his regular family, and the aspiring wrestlers who adored him. With a regular check coming in, he did very limited appearances. Due to the phlebitis, it wasn't healthy to fly long distances regularly, and he charged what was considered crazy money, which, by choice, limited the offers. At this point, the FCW/Performance Center era has produced only a few genuine superstars from scratch: Roman Reigns, Bray Wyatt, and the Rusev and Lana act. Rhodes had taken Reigns under his wing from the start and instilled confidence in him. He had taken him from a guy who couldn't do a promo to someone who was said, according to Rob Naylor, who was Dusty's assistant for several years, to be able to do a very good old-school improv promo. Unfortunately, that's not what they do these days on the main roster, and he's still trying to find his way in delivering scripted promos. But the entire Bray Wyatt character was the brainchild of Rhodes, working with the real-life Wyndham Rotunda. Rhodes was the one who made the call to put Rusev and Lana together as an act. He also made the call to switch Byron Saxton from a wrestler and then a manager to an announcer, which gave him the chance to go on the main roster. It would be impossible to list all the talent over the years who he gave breaks to or who he inspired in some form. Tommy Dreamer noted that the name Dreamer was because his favorite wrestler was the American Dream. In my own life, my son, named Cody, got his name because I happened to be talking to Dusty Rhodes a few hours before my wife decided it was the day to pick a name. I only talked to Dusty Rhodes a few times, and while he hated me for years because of the nature of what I did at a time those in power and wrestling hated the idea of it, he was still always charming in those conversations. During the conversation he talked about his son, Cody, who was in Hollywood at the time studying to be an actor, a few years before Cody gave up on that dream and ended up as a pro wrestler. But he got his name because of a conversation with Dusty Rhodes. And his best friend is named Dusty, because his parents, who I don't even know, grew up idolizing Dusty Rhodes. But today's world is very different from the one he came from. Tracing the history of Dusty Rhodes is often difficult. While Rhodes has written an autobiography and has done countless interviews, he was a storyteller who even would joke that you never let the truth get in the way of a good story. A classic example was just recently, in promoting the event at the Jewish Community Center in Tampa. Before the modern arenas were built in the city, the 6,000-seat Armory was the biggest arena in a city that had no professional sports franchises, so the pro sport of choice was Championship Wrestling from Florida, which can be broken down in 3 eras, based on the babyface legend who carried the business at the time: Eddie Graham 1962-69, Jack Briscoe 1970-74, and Dusty Rhodes 1974-83. All the big stars from Elvis on down played at the Armory, but aside from wrestling, he was best known for President John F. Kennedy giving a speech there. Dusty would tell the story that Kennedy was a wrestling fan, and when he was arranging speeches, he chose the Armory because he wanted to give a speech in the same arena that Dusty Rhodes performed in. Of course, that story was Hogan-esque. Kennedy's speech at the Armory was on November 18, 1963, just 4 days before he was killed in Dallas. Rhodes was still a teenager, and his first match at the Armory was in 1970. Dusty always claimed that while his father named him Virgil, he never called him Virgil, nor did anyone else. He claimed he was always Dusty, named after his father's favorite baseball player, Dusty Rhodes. He couldn't have always been Dusty. James Dusty Rhodes was a marginal player, although he was actually relatively famous at the time Virgil Runnels Jr. was growing up. Dusty Rhodes, the baseball star, was best known as a pinch hitter for the New York Giants. Because he played in New York, where almost all the national media was based in those days, he became a relatively famous baseball player when he hit a home run as a pinch hitter in the bottom of the 10th inning to give the Giants a win in the first game of the 1954 World Series at the Polo Grounds in New York. That home run, nicknamed the Chinese home run at the time because it barely cleared the 258-foot right field fence, along with another home run he hit in the second game, and a key hit in the third game, gave him a legacy that far exceeded that of a normal player, a lifetime .253 hitter who played 7 seasons. The Giants swept the heavily favored Cleveland Indians, who had set a record with 111 regular season wins. It became a famous World Series, because after 21 years of despair, the Giants finally won the big one. The two most memorable moments were Rhodes' home run to win the first game and one of the most famous outfield catches of all time by Willie Mays on a hit by Vic Wertz that saved the first game. Virgil Runnels Jr. would have been 6 before the original Dusty Rhodes had debuted with the Giants, and would have been almost 9 before Rhodes gained fame as a pinch hitter from hitting 2 home runs in that World Series, So the stories that his father and family never called him Virgil, and never called him Dusty even as a young child have a timing issue. Of course, if his father started calling him Dusty at 9, that is likely almost as far back as he would be remembering things. Growing up in Austin, Texas, he was a good high school football and baseball player, but years earlier, fell in love with pro wrestling. His father, Virgil Runnels, a 6'2", 280-pound part Choctaw Indian from Oklahoma, was a plumber, so the son of a plumber story is true, and also a big wrestling fan. He'd work long hours all week, and during the summers, Dusty would work with him. Once a week, they'd go out to dinner and head to the wrestling matches. He and his brother and sister set up a ring in the backyard of their house, using a garden hose for ropes and with stakes in the ground that they couldn't figure out how to keep from falling down. His younger brother and the neighbor kids would play pro wrestlers, copying the moves they saw at the local matches. The kids all played the roles of different area stars, but Dusty was always Luthez, playing the world champion, and meaning that he always won in the end. Perhaps that's why Rhodes' multi-year quest to win the NWA world title, the belt Thez made famous, was so believable during the 70s, because it was his dream since childhood. Of course, when he finally strapped on the belt for real 22 years later, he was the polar opposite of his childhood hero. He played football and baseball in high school, and wound up in Amarillo, Texas, attending West Texas State University, now West Texas On. Legend has it that he had a baseball scholarship, but also went out for the football team as a walk-on. Dory Funk Jr., who attended the college a few years earlier, said after all these years, he didn't know if the West Texas State football stories were even true. Terry Funk was a star offensive guard on the football team, and has memories of Dusty as a linebacker on the team and a catcher on the baseball team, and said he remembered him as a pretty good player. But there is no Virgil Runnels or Dusty Runnels on the roster for any season of West Texas State football, so at best he was a practice squad member. When he was a pro wrestler, Gordon Soley always pushed the idea that Rhodes was a Major League Baseball prospect as a shortstop, likely Rhodes thinking shortstop sounded better because it was a position that suggested more athletic ability and agility than catcher. The Rhodes legend was always that he didn't have a great body, but was an excellent natural athlete in spite of it. During his wrestling heyday, Soley would constantly tell the story that when Rhodes came out of West Texas State, he had offers to turn pro in 3 sports, football, baseball and wrestling, but chose wrestling. While exaggerated, Eddie Graham loved to promote legitimate athletes, thinking it gave the business credibility. It was also a key because Rhodes, as the years went by, didn't have a body that looked like an athlete, although he was, until the latter stages of his career, quite agile for his size and had great hand speed. A lot of future pro wrestlers, including Ted DiBiase, Tully Blanchard, and Kelly Kinniski, would attend West Texas State years later specifically because it was the home of the Funks and the Amarillo territory. All 3 came from wrestling families and knew the Funks as highly regarded trainers, and that so many stars came from the college a few years earlier, really the era of Terry Funk, Bobby Duncombe, Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody, Rhodes and Murdoch, who never actually attended the school, but told people he did for so long that everyone believed it. And he even played in but actually helped coach several alumni football games. But when Dusty came out of high school, there was no such reputation. While West Texas State was not a football powerhouse by any means, if you watched championship wrestling from Florida, or Georgia championship wrestling during the 70s and early 80s, you'd think it was Michigan, Ohio State or Oklahoma the way it was put over. Soley would talk about the great athletes that came out of the school, which had produced 2, and later 3 when Dusty finally won the title, world champions, and would bring it up as the college that produced such sports stars as Dusty Rhodes, the Funks, Mercury Morris, a major star on the Super Bowl winning Miami Dolphins in the early 70s, Dwayne Thomas, one of the NFL's best running backs of that era with the Dallas Cowboys, and as the years went by, names like DiBiase, Stan Hansen, Bruiser Brody, Duncombe and others were part of that same conversation. To wrestling fans, it became a mythical place of alpha males, rural cowboys who played football, drank, hit up women and cleaned out bars and street fights, with Dusty as its John Wayne. Still, to this day, Terry Funk wonders, because he would keep bumping into Rhodes far more than he should have around town, if Rhodes coming to Amarillo was not so much to go to college as much as to open the doors to pro wrestling. I knew Dusty from football, said Terry Funk, who along with Ric Flair, Ole Anderson and Harley Race were probably Rhodes' 4 biggest career rivals. He was behind me when I started in the business. He was still playing football when I started. While Rhodes was going to college, he got a job working at a gas station that was owned by Dory Funk Sr.'s brother-in-law, which also may indicate his choice of Amarillo for college was more to get into pro wrestling. Terry Funk remembered in his first year in the business, he saw Dusty working at the gas station. In those days, there was no such thing as self-service, and Dusty's job was to pump the gas for the customers. "I had bought a maroon Ford Galaxy 500, a new car," said Terry Funk. "I pulled into the gas station and told Dusty to fill it up. He said, 'Terry, this sure is a pretty car. I'll have to have a car like that someday.' I told him, 'Maybe someday you will.' He'd also see Dusty out of the corner of his eye every Thursday night. Dusty and Duncombe were always in the bleachers, sometimes bringing other friends from college, watching the matches and studying. Duncombe was a genuine star on the team and later played a season in the NFL with the St. Louis Cardinals before having a solid career as a pro wrestler. Rhodes' version of the story is that he and Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody, were bouncing at the same bar and Goodish was also part of their group at the matches. It's possible there was an overlap, although Funk noted that Goodish didn't arrive at West Texas until after Dusty had left, as he was a transfer from Iowa who played on the 1967 and 1968 teams. Dusty was on the East Coast during the 1967 football season. But it is possible during the summer of 1967 that they could have been in Amarillo at the same time. By the fall of 1967, Dusty Runnels was a linebacker with the Hartford Charter Oaks of the old Continental Football League, a minor league operation at the time. The team folded, and he saw a newspaper ad for a wrestling show, run by promoter Tony Santos, at the Boston Annex. It was a small operation. Runnels showed up, and at 6'2" and 245 pounds, he was a big man for that era, with big shoulders and looked like a strong athlete. Most of the wrestlers in those days weren't svelte or ripped, and he certainly never was, even when he was young. He told the promoters he was a pro wrestler from Texas, and was trained by the Funks. While none of that was true, the mention of being trained by the Funks opened the door. Dusty Runnels' first recorded pro wrestling match was December 21, 1967, against a guy named Big Luke Summerfield. Some time later, since his family's name was mentioned as having trained the guy, Terry Funk heard the story of how Summerfield remarked after the match, "This guy wrestles like he's never been in the ring in his life." Dusty's version of the story is that he wrestled 3 shows for Santos, earning $36 total. In his autobiography, in which, even when the math didn't add up right, co-author Howard Brody was told by Dusty to not change one word or story, he claimed that $8 a match wasn't cutting it, and he quit wrestling for a year, until what he said was what he considered the first match of his career, in San Antonio against Reggie Parks. In actuality, after however many matches he had for Santos, he ended up in Windsor, ONT doing television jobs. In his second match in the territory, he teamed with somebody named Anastic Besnick, to lose to stars Ernie Ladd and Baron von Raschke. There was never a 1-year break. He had a few matches over 3 weeks for Santos, and 10 days later, in late January 1968, he was working full-time in Ohio, as prelim wrestler Dusty Runnels, including a few matches against Victor the Wrestling Bear. His first major arena booking was May 12, 1968, at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, losing the opening match to the Oklahoma Kid, on a show headlined by Edward Carpentier versus the Assassin. In this case it was John Hill, later Stomper Guy Mitchell and Jerry Valiant. A few days after that match, he drove back to Texas. The wrestler Dusty Rhodes, long before becoming the American Dream, was born a couple of weeks later. He ended up in San Antonio, where he got some training from Joe Blanchard, the father of Tully Blanchard. Before a match on May 27, 1968, in Fort Worth, he took the name Dusty Rhodes, and beat veteran Bulldog Danny Pletches. Gary Hart always claimed to have given him the name Dusty Rhodes, saying he had watched a 1957 movie with Andy Griffith called Face in the Crowd, where Griffith played the lead character named Dusty Rhodes. In actuality, the character in that movie was named Larry Lonesome Rhodes. "I helped him get booked, and I watched him a few times and the guy was excellent," Hart said. "He had fantastic charisma, and I told him the name Virgil Runnels wasn't very good." Dusty's version adds up more, particularly since Dusty Rhodes was his father's favorite baseball player and he was already nicknamed after him. He claimed he came up with the name after a conversation with Pletches. Dusty's story is his career took off at his first show in Dallas, where he was booked to lose to Grizzly Smith, the father of Jake Roberts, and a major star of the era, at the fabled Dallas Sportatorium. The story is Smith saw so much in him that he switched the finish in the ring, put him over, and the next thing you know, in his second week of his career, he was in a tag team main event against Thez, his idol. In actuality, he lost that match to Smith as planned. But he impressed people enough in that match that his fortunes quickly changed from being a job guy like in Ohio, to getting a push. He got major wins over Nick and Jerry Kozak, two area regulars that were guys his brother and his friends would pretend to be when doing jobs in the backyard for Dusty as Thez a decade earlier. The Thez tag team match did happen, but not until August 27, 1968, where Dusty Rhodes and the spoiler Don Jardine beat the mismatched team of Thez and former legendary heel-turned babyface Duke Kiyomaka in a 2-out-of-3 fall main event at the Sportatorium. According to Dusty, he claimed that he just had an American title match with Fritz von Erich, the area's top star, and made $700 when he got a phone call from George Wilson, the coach of the Miami Dolphins, wanting him to come to Florida for a tryout with the team. He claimed he'd seen him play, but couldn't guarantee him any money unless he made the team. Dusty's story is that, after that payoff, he decided he was going to stay a wrestler. It's hard to believe that an NFL coach would know about a player who was never on the roster of his college team, let alone call him personally. And in those days, a $700 payoff for a Texas match that wasn't in Houston doesn't sound too plausible either. By the time he left Texas to move to Kansas City the first week of October, he was a rising star, and brought in with a push. In his third week in the territory, he beat Pat O'Connor, a former world champion who was one of the legends of the industry. 2 weeks later, promoter Bob Geigel decided to put him in a tag team with another young wrestler named Dick Murdoch, putting them in cowboy hats and calling them the Texas Outlaws. Murdoch was the son of a star Amarillo wrestler named Frankie Hill Murdoch. While he and Rhodes were the same age, he had started several years earlier, using the name Ron Carson as the younger brother of Don Carson on the Gulf Coast. Murdoch was already one of the best young wrestlers in the business, and even that early in his career there were promoters pegging him as a future world champion. It wasn't long before the two were considered one of the best tag teams in wrestling. On November 7, 1968, the Texas Outlaws beat Tommy and Terry Martin, better known as the Cormier or Burke brothers, to win the North American Tag Team Championship at Memorial Hall in Kansas City. He also captured the Central States heavyweight title a month later, and he was on his way. When he left the territory, he bid adieu to Murdoch. He returned to Texas in March 1969 as a main event heel, working on top against the likes of Jose Lothario, Fritz von Erich, and Flying Fred Curry, and teaming with Von Raschke. He then moved to Amarillo in September, where he formed a tag team with future rival Harley Race, and had numerous matches with Terry Funk, Nick Bockwinkel, and Dory Funk Sr. "What a wonderful character he was in this business," said Terry Funk. "He was probably the greatest character since Gorgeous George, with the exception of Hulk Hogan. But Hogan had that extra push. But to have a guy who didn't make his name with Vince McMahon, what a response from the wrestling world and the love for him that they showed." Murdoch was back in Amarillo in February, and the Outlaws reunited for a match with Terry Funk and Ricky Romero, and they gave notice to work for the Sheik. It was in 1970 that the Texas Outlaws started getting recognition as one of the country's best tag teams and as major stars. They became the top tag team in 3 promotions at the same time, all of which were doing strong business, since it was the heyday of the Sheik, and they were the heels right underneath. For the Sheik in Michigan and Ohio, they captured that area's version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship from Ben Justice and the Stomper, Guy Mitchell. 6 days earlier, for Pedro Martinez and Johnny Powers, they had won a tournament to create the first NWF World Tag Team Champions in a promotion that ran in upstate New York and parts of Pennsylvania, as well as the Cleveland area, that for a long time was considered the golden age of wrestling in that city. In addition, they worked as the top tag team for Frank Tunney in Toronto. It was during this period that they started getting all kinds of magazine publicity, bragging about bar fights and smoking cigars. While the NWA had different world tag team champions, the 2 major ones were based in Detroit and San Francisco. But Roy Shire hated wrestling magazines, so his champions got minimal national publicity. Since the NWA was much larger than the WWF or AWA as far as territory went, even though the tag champs were mostly regional, Murdoch and Rhodes, holding 2 different versions of the World Tag Team titles at the same time, were pushed as the top tag team in the world in magazines for much of 1970, and this publicity made them national names to the ardent fans around the country. During this period they also defended those NWA titles in places like Florida and Texas. The 2 next moved full-time to Florida in September. At the time, Florida was the most respected wrestling territory in the country. Eddie Graham, still at his peak, was considered a booking genius. While the money wasn't the best, the talent was top-notch because everyone wanted to come to Florida. Wrestling was respected far more than just about anywhere in the country except St. Louis. The wrestlers were considered major stars, and Florida had the hottest women fans in the country. The Texas Outlaws were brought in with a major push since they had already defended the World Tag Team titles in the state and now were coming in full-time. The first night they were at television at the Tampa Sportatorium, they defeated World Champion Dory Funk Jr. and top babyface Jose Lothario in the morning, and that night in Jacksonville, beat Lothario and Argentina Apollo to capture the Florida Tag Team Championships. They weren't there long when an even better offer came. While Florida was the most respected territory in the U.S., the biggest money promotion in the world was Jim Barnett's World Championship Wrestling in Australia. After their success as the top tag team in the U.S., they got an offer to come to Australia and win the IWA World Tag Team titles. They left Florida abruptly. Not only were they still the Florida Tag Team champions, but Dusty had just beaten Lothario to win the Brass Knucks title, and 2 weeks later they headed to Texas to do a short program where they put over Tim Woods and George Scott for the American Tag Team titles, since beating one of the country's top tag teams would make Woods and Scott a stronger team, and it was off to Australia. The Texas Outlaws came into Australia at the start of 1971, managed by Playboy Gary Hart, but what was supposed to be a long lucrative run only lasted 3 months. They were over big time as main event heels, said Australia historian Kirk Beattie. Their association with Hart, an all-time great heel character in Australia, served to emphasize the situation. The Outlaws had quality matches against the stars of that time such as Mark Lewin, Mario Milano, Killer Kowalski, and Spiros Arion. They beat Lewin and Milano to win the IWA tag titles on January 22, 1971, in Sydney. In Australia, the wrestlers flew all over the country due to a deal Barnett had with the local airlines, and they stayed in the country's nicest hotels. Barnett insisted that they come across as professionals during their entire stay, because he wanted nothing that would make the business look bad. Wrestlers had to always wear business attire, a dress shirt, nice pants, a tie, a jacket and dress shoes, whenever they were in public. Barnett knew that didn't fit the gimmick of the Texas Outlaws tag team, so he told them to wear nice denim blue jeans, cowboy boots and cowboy string ties with nice shirts, so they would look like stars but still dress like their gimmick. But they ignored the dress code. They were walking around King's Cross, the red light district of Sydney, with cut-off t-shirts and short jeans, almost like Daisy Dukes. Barnett was living in a hotel penthouse in King's Cross, and while walking through the area, saw them. He immediately ordered them to drop the titles on February 20, 1971, in Melbourne, worked rematch programs in all the major cities for the next month, and sent them home. Rhodes went on his own to Texas, and then moved to Leroy McGuirk's promotion, to be the top heel for a run against the top face, perennial North American champion cowboy Bill Watts. His first appearance on TV for me was in Oklahoma City on WKY-TV with Danny Williams, the commentator, and Leroy McGuirk, my partner in this first venture by me into the promotional side of the business, recalled Watts in a letter. I had laid down certain parameters about our TV show, and he broke them all that night, wouldn't you just know it. I literally came out of the dressing room and chased him out of the ring. That was not a work, that wonderful rascal. He worked through November, winning and losing the title to Watts. He also worked a program as a heel against world champion Dory Funk Jr., and after losing a blow-off match to Watts in October, finished up with a program with Ivan Putski, ending his stay at a loser leaves town match in Shreveport. It was that run as North American champion and matches with Watts and Funk Jr. that established Rhodes as a major heel singles money draw. The next stop was actually Japan for a month for the Eway, where he was booked by Vern Gagne, as a prelude to coming to the AWA at the start of 1972. Rhodes fit perfectly there. He bragged about being a bar-room brawler, which led to a natural feud with the Crusher. He first formed a tag team with Larry Hennig. Milwaukee was selling out every month as it was, but they shot an angle in a tag match with Rhodes and Hennig versus Crusher and Wahoo McDaniel, to lead to the big showdown. Crusher was to face Rhodes in a saloon match. A saloon match was Milwaukee's version of a lumberjack match. Crusher explained that in the bar fights he's in, the patrons don't let the cowards run away. If they try and run, they are thrown back in. The idea that the Texas bar-room brawler was coming to Milwaukee, Crusher's hometown, saw them book the larger NBA building that they only used for the biggest shows, and they drew a sellout of 12,062 fans on June 17, 1972. Murdoch arrived in November and the Outlaws were formed as a full-time team. This was during the period where they were filming the 1974 movie The Wrestler. There was a scene in the movie where the promoter, played by Ed Asner, was yelling at Rhodes and Murdoch because they were getting into trouble beating too many people up in bar fights, and told them no matter what, no more fighting. In the scene, a karate guy, played by pro wrestler Harold Sakata, the former Olympic weightlifting silver medalist, starts harassing people at the bar and making fun of them, tried to intimidate them, including pouring their drinks over their head and dousing them with their own beer as they had to hold their temper because they promised the promoter they'd get in no more fights. The scene ends with them finally having enough, after watching the karate guy beat up the bar owner, and the two cleaned house in a campy fight scene. Rhodes and Murdoch started out as heels in the movie, but ended up as charming baby faces, even if they were matched with Dick the Bruiser and Crusher on the Big Show at the end. So Gagne was probably already seeing the future. Probably the most famous story of that period was when the two, in real life, after a match in Edina, Minnesota, while drinking at the local bar, got talked into buying a donkey as a pet. They had a 3-day road trip, so left enough food and water for the donkey, but the donkey wasn't used to living alone in an apartment complex. The donkey shit all over the apartment, and when they got back, they were kicked out. Gagne was furious, because while he liked the idea of the wrestlers being seen as wild characters, he didn't like his business peers hearing those kind of stories about his guys trashing apartments and being kicked out. But the Texas cowboy street fights against the old established baddest of the beer-drinking bar-room street fighters from the Midwest, Bruiser and Crusher, was a natural rivalry. There weren't a lot of matches with the two teams, because Bruiser had his own territory and didn't work much in the AWA, but the team sold out Chicago's amphitheater on March 9, 1973. They worked with all the top faces, but with Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel as World Tag Team Champions, generally considered the best tag team in the world at the time, they were always the number 2 heel team. Since the AWA often ran multiple shows, they still headlined all the time, regularly on top against Billy Robinson and Don Morocco. Rhodes was a successful main event heel, but the first taste of what was to come came one night at a house show on March 10, 1973, in Rockford, Illinois. The Outlaws were finishing up in early June, headed to Japan, and then Rhodes was going to return to Florida. Gagne booked a rare battle of heels for the tag titles, Stevens and Bockwinkel versus the Texas Outlaws. Stevens and Bockwinkel, as champions, worked as heels. Murdoch, the better worker of the Outlaws, sold most of the way. Rhodes tagged in and started shaking his body, like he had seen Thunderbolt Patterson do earlier in his career, and did what at the time would be considered the black babyface comeback, except using elbows to the top of the head in place of headbutts. The place went crazy. With them leaving, they followed that match up with an April program in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and the same thing happened. Since they were on the way out, Stevens and Bockwinkel beat the Outlaws to keep the titles in Milwaukee, Denver, and Winnipeg. It was during this period that Ric Flair was just breaking in as a prelim wrestler. While Flair emulated Ray Stevens, and loved superstar Billy Graham for his physique, he wanted to be Ramblin' Ricky Rhodes, the brother, or cousin of Dusty Rhodes. Gagne thought Ric Flair was a better name. While legend has it Dusty told him the same thing, Sullivan remembers that summer, when Rhodes was back in Florida, that Dusty was pitching Eddie Graham on Ramblin' Ricky Rhodes, a 275-pound powerlifter-looking guy. Dusty was already becoming Eddie's darling. I was upstairs, Dusty was with Eddie, and Dusty told me, "Hey, I want you to see a picture of my brother, Ricky Rhodes." It was Ric Flair, with short hair, 300 pounds, his body looked like Dusty's a little. Rhodes came to Florida as a singles heel, and a month in, beat Bill Dromo in Miami Beach to win the Southern title. While in the AWA, the top promo was superstar Billy Graham, who emulated Muhammad Ali. Rhodes was a good talker, but couldn't do the style he'd become famous for since all the rhyming was Graham's gimmick. When he came to Florida, as a heel, he combined Ali and Graham, combined with his lisp and famous cadence and delivery. He was a strong main event heel in a successful territory. But he was also hilarious. I can recall little things, the jive talk, in his biggest feud at the time, against Jos, pronounced Joe, LeDuc, a Canadian lumberjack strongman, who also had a worked brother Paul, who was smaller. Rhodes would talk about matches against Jose LeDuc and call Paul Snuffy Smith, after a Sunday morning newspaper cartoon character. He'd talk about the babyfaces who were after my Southern, which he called his Southern title. He'd brag about making $90,000 a year. That's probably more than he was making at the time, but it was a financial level that only the top athletes in major sports were earning. And he called himself the American Dream. Few recall that the American Dream was actually a heel persona to mock the working people of Florida. He wore his fancy robes, bragged about his money, women, and street fighting prowess in what was a cross between the rough and gritty persona of later rival Ole Anderson, and the glamour and glitz persona of Flair. On December 18, 1973 in Tampa, Rhodes, as Southern champion, pinned Luthez. That result was key because it showed that Eddie Graham had brought in the all-time legend, with the idea that Rhodes was going to be more than just that year's lead singles heel. Rhodes was flown back to the AWA a few times in 1974 as a babyface, usually to work against superstar Graham, Bockwinkel or Stevens, or a combination of two of those three. He had established himself as a real crowd favorite by this point. And in Florida, people were starting to like him because of his interviews. On April 17, 1974, at a sold-out at the Miami Beach Convention Center, it was Step 1. World champion Jack Briscoe was defending against Rhodes. Rhodes had worked numerous times with Briscoe, usually getting beaten since Briscoe was the top guy in the NWA and the biggest wrestling star in Florida. Watts was booking at the time. At first, Watts and Rhodes didn't get along. Rhodes went behind Watts back to Eddie Graham. Watts found out and wanted to fire him. "I'm going to fire the fat prick because I won't have anybody going behind my back to you," Watts said he told Eddie Graham. "Unless you want him to be the booker, and then I'll go." Eddie Graham saw it was time to turn Rhodes. Rhodes stayed with Briscoe in a mostly clean match. Briscoe put him over in a few spots that he normally wouldn't for a heel. Graham's idea was that people would see that Rhodes, if he wanted to be, was on Briscoe's level. Then, at 47 minutes, Rhodes dropped the elbow, his finishing move, on Briscoe. At the count of 2, Briscoe put his leg over the ropes. People had never seen Briscoe have to save his title like that. The crowd, for an instant, booed Briscoe. The match started with Briscoe as most people in the crowd's all-time favorite. While Briscoe was actually from Oklahoma, everyone by that point thought of him as the Florida native who rose the ranks and brought his adopted home state its first world championship. And how people were wanting Rhodes to win it. The emotion only lasted a few minutes. The smarter fans at that point figured a 60-minute draw, which is what Graham figured they would do. Instead, Briscoe charged at Rhodes, who instinctively backflipped him over the top rope for the DQ. He wanted the disappointing moment where it ended instead of the draw. Pak Song, a giant Korean who looked like a shorter version of Giant Baba, was forming a tag team with Rhodes, managed by Gary Hart. There were teases, as Hart was favoring Song. And Rhodes questioned Hart about an American aligning himself so closely with a Korean. Probably the most famous angle in the history of championship wrestling from Florida took place a few weeks later. On May 14, 1974, at the Tampa Sportatorium, Rhodes and Song faced Eddie Graham and his son Mike. Hart and Song turned on Rhodes and beat him bloody. And kept beating on him. Nobody would save him. All the heels wouldn't cross Hart. All the faces hated Rhodes. Finally, Mike Graham, not Eddie Graham, had enough. Mike wanted to make the save. Eddie, his father, the godfather of wrestling in Florida, ordered him not to. Mike, a pushed babyface who was still thought of as Eddie's 22-year-old son, defied his father's orders and hit the ring, chasing Song and Hart out. It was clear that Eddie was using the angle to not only make Dusty his top star, but his son Dusty's key sidekick. Dusty watched his beating and talked his talk, and said, when Mike Graham jumped in, Mike Graham just became a man. Mike Graham became the first babyface to team with Dusty before the others would, and it was portrayed that the two had a bond, which was far more beneficial to Graham than Dusty, until the real heyday of the promotion was over a decade later. "I was there when he flipped over," said Sullivan. Dusty has a gigantic ego, as we all know, but all the shit he talked about coming out of the turn, every bit of it was true. Everywhere was sold out. In Miami, they were scalping tickets for $50. He always kept himself strong and always landed on his feet. He'd fall out of favor at times, but he'd bounce back. He was a larger-than-life personality. "It took everyone aback," said Sullivan. "Eddie was a genius, but how big Dusty got immediately, it floored him. That run was the most successful they ever had in Florida. They had big things before, but when Dusty flipped, he just connected with the people." It's been said before, the blacks came out in droves to see him. We have a tendency to look back and say the grass was greener, the beer was colder, and before he turned, we had a lot of black fans, especially in Miami Beach. Island blacks, itinerant workers, they all attached themselves to him. Black or white. The working class guys. He became their hero. Dusty Rhodes vs. Pak Song in the summer of 1974 was the biggest drawing feud the territory ever saw. With no music, Dusty came out to a reaction the likes of which only the biggest stars in the history of the business could ever match. Once, Song on television squeezed an egg end to end and it broke, to show what he would do to Rhodes' head at the arenas that week. Rhodes came out, egg in hand, squeezed it, and broke it right in front of Song and Hart. The matches were simple. The giant Korean with a vice-like grip would use his claw either to Dusty's head, and he'd bleed buckets, or to his shoulder, and Dusty would blade the shoulder. Dusty would sell, he would twitch, and eventually he'd make his comeback. Then there would be a referee bump, and then they would go to a finish, usually a DQ to build to next week's match, or a finish that would naturally lead to next week's gimmick match. There were Texas death matches, street fights, cage matches, and what would go forward as Dusty's specialty, the bull rope matches. The matches weren't all that long, usually about 10-12 minutes, and there was little in the way of wrestling. Rhodes became a bleeder, and his opponents would bleed with him. They had all kinds of great workers in those days who could do that on the undercard. The idea was to go in the main cities until they stopped selling out. They ran weekly. They started in late May. They were still going strong in August. Gary Hart put a bounty on Dusty, and had brought in all kinds of heels, from Dusty's supposed football teammates, the Funks and Duncombe, and even Murdoch, to the thick supposed martial arts master, Professor Toru Tanaka. In probably his next major angle, it was a kill or be killed with Terry Funk, who is probably remembered, even more than Song, as Rhodes' biggest rival of that era. It all stemmed from an I Quit match, with a finish similar to what Funk later did in the empty arena match with Jerry Lawler. Neither could get the other to quit, no matter how bloody and crazy the match went. Funk got desperate looking for the Gary Hart bounty, and broke a beer bottle over the post and tried to jab the glass into Rhodes' eye. Rhodes reversed, and drove the broken bottle into Funk's eye. Funk bladed the eye, which actually drooped from that angle, and screamed that he couldn't see, absolutely freaked out, quit, and screamed about being blinded. Funk, for years, would point to his droopy eye on interviews, building countless rematches as a reminder of that angle. I'll never forget the interview he had with Gordon Soley about being the son of a plumber and his father carrying a brown bag for lunch, said Watts. And then he talked about Gary Hart and Pak Song-dam, and my arm broke out in goosebumps as I realized Dusty Rhodes, superstar, had arrived. Notably enough, Dusty Rhodes may have never wrestled Jack Briscoe again in the state of Florida. He definitely never did as long as Briscoe was world champion, although there were Briscoe versus Rhodes matches in Georgia. The reputation of Rhodes went everywhere. While based in Florida, he'd worked big shows for the AWA in the Carolinas, regularly in Georgia and Texas, and became, along with Andre the Giant and the NWA World Champion, the biggest touring attraction in the sport. He was a huge favorite in New York, since the Florida television show aired on Monday nights on a Spanish-language station. Once Terry Funk beat Jack Briscoe to become world champion, Rhodes was the perennial #1 contender. Like Briscoe before him, Rhodes would constantly, against Funk, and later race, come close, and draw his biggest crowds when he'd tell the fans that this time he was bringing the belt home. It became an issue because Rhodes wasn't what the NWA wanted as a world champion. Plus, Rhodes could tour and draw without the belt, and with the champion and Rhodes you had two different natural draws, plus you had Rhodes challenging for the belt. Eventually, people were tiring of Rhodes trying and failing. That made things difficult. And really, it wasn't beneficial to Eddie Graham to make Rhodes world champion, because he'd have less dates on him. Unlike in the early 70s with Briscoe, he no longer had the depth and overall strength of the promotion as in its heyday. On August 21, 1979, at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa, a sellout crowd saw Rhodes beat Race to win the world title. But this was only for Florida and wasn't acknowledged anywhere else except in Georgia after the fact, because Rhodes always wanted to be billed as a former world champion, a designation that meant so much in those days. Holding the title for a week would in most circumstances hurt him, like they waited from early 1975 for this moment, it happens, and then it meant nothing. Plus, Rhodes still had to be able to have a viable enough excuse that he could still draw chasing Race after losing it back. So they had Rhodes beat Terry Funk 4 days later at a big show in St. Petersburg. The very next afternoon he beat Don Morocco in Jacksonville. He was scheduled against Race hours later, on August 26, 1979, in Orlando. Before the match, Terry Funk destroyed Rhodes with a chair shot beating. While those kind of angles weren't that unusual, the world title was booked differently. Rhodes still went through with his match with Race, and lost the title. More to come. 6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6*6 3 stars. Dusty Rhodes' career title history. NWA World Heavyweight Def. Harley Race August 21, 1979 Tampa. Lost to Harley Race August 26, 1979 Orlando Def. Harley Race June 21, 1981 Atlanta. Lost to Ric Flair September 17, 1981 Kansas City as Midnight Rider Def. Ric Flair February 9, 1983 Miami Beach, vacated title when refusing to remove his mask, def. Ric Flair July 26, 1986 Greensboro, lost to Ric Flair August 9, 1986 St. Louis. NWA World Tag Team, with Dick Slater def. Gene and Ole Anderson September 23, 1977 Atlanta, lost to Gene and Ole Anderson October 14, 1977 Atlanta, with Manny Fernandez def. Ivan Koloff and Don Kernodle October 20, 1984 Greensboro, lost to Ivan and Nikita Koloff March 18, 1985 Fayetteville. NWA World Tag Team, Michigan/Ohio version, with Dick Murdoch def. Ben Justice and the Stomper, Guy Mitchell, March 18, 1970 Mansfield, Ohio, lost to Bobo Brazil and Lord Athol Leighton August 8, 1970 Detroit. IWA World Tag Team, with Dick Murdoch def. Mark Lewin and Mario Milano January 22, 1971 Sydney, lost to Mark Lewin and Killer Kowalski February 27, 1971 Melbourne. NWA World Six-Man, with Road Warriors def. Ivan Koloff and Nikita Koloff and Baron von Raschke, replacing Crusher Khrushchev on team, May 17, 1986 Baltimore, lost to Ivan Koloff and Warlord and Barbarian February 12, 1988 Philadelphia. Paul Ellering replaced injured Road Warrior Animal in match, with Road Warriors def. Ric Flair and Arnold Anderson and Tully Blanchard July 9, 1988 Chicago to win vacant titles. Rhodes lost his share of titles after Road Warriors turned heel and Animal beat Rhodes December 7, 1988 Chattanooga. NWF World Tag Team, with Dick Murdoch def. Ben Justice and the Stomper in tournament final to create first champions March 12, 1970 Cleveland, lost to Johnny Powers and Chief White Owl August 29, 1970 Akron. NWA United States Heavyweight def. Lex Luger November 26, 1987 Chicago, title vacated April 5, 1988 for attacking Jim Crockett. NWA United States Heavyweight West Coast def. Dick Slater November 8, 1980 San Francisco to win vacant title, held title when promotion folded January 1981. NWA National Heavyweight def. Buddy Landel in fictitious match when Landel was unable to appear at a television taping due to stance issues December 19, 1985, lost to Tully Blanchard March 4, 1986 Spartanburg, South Carolina. NWA World Television def. Tully Blanchard March 6, 1985 Greensboro, lost to Tully Blanchard April 28, 1985 Charlotte, def. Tully Blanchard July 6, 1985 Charlotte, title vacated October 19, 1985 based on being unable to defend title after broken leg angle after attack by the Four Horsemen, def. Arnold Anderson September 5, 1986 Columbia, South Carolina, lost to Tully Blanchard in First Blood match November 27, 1986 Greensboro. NWA Southern Heavyweight def. Bill Dromo September 5, 1973 Miami Beach, lost to Thunderbolt Patterson October 2, 1973 Tampa, def. Thunderbolt Patterson October 9, 1973 Tampa, title held up versus Paul Jones October 16, 1973 Tampa, def. Paul Jones October 23, 1973 Tampa, lost to Jos LeDuc February 5, 1974 Tampa, def. Jos LeDuc March 12, 1974 Tampa, title held up after match with Pak Song July 18, 1974 Jacksonville, def. Pak Song July 20, 1974 St. Petersburg, lost to Pak Song July 25, 1974 Jacksonville, def. Harley Race September 25, 1975 West Palm Beach, lost to Harley Race September 1975, def. The Assassin Jody Hamilton, May 4, 1976 Tampa, lost to the Assassin June 8, 1976 Tampa, def. Dick Slater June 18, 1978 Sarasota, lost to Dick Slater 1978, def. Bad Leroy Brown February 16, 1980 Jacksonville, vacated title July 1980 to train for world title shot, def. Jimmy Garvin October 31, 1982 Orlando, lost to Kevin Sullivan November 22, 1982 West Palm Beach. NWA Florida Heavyweight def. Bill Watts October 22, 1974 Tampa, lost to Cowboy Bill Watts November 12, 1974 Tampa, def. Cowboy Bill Watts November 28, 1974 Jacksonville, lost to Cowboy Bill Watts December 6, 1974 Jacksonville, def. Bob Roop September 16, 1975 Tampa, title vacated after October 28, 1975 match with King Curtis Aokia, def. Bob Orton Jr. July 27, 1976 Tampa, lost to superstar Billy Graham November 22, 1976 West Palm Beach, def. Superstar Billy Graham February 15, 1977 Tampa, def. Buddy Wolf June 1977, lost to Ernie Ladd July 15, 1977 Tallahassee. Title returned to Rhodes August 1977 when Ladd left territory, lost to Lars Anderson September 20, 1977 Tampa, def. Lars Anderson November 26, 1977 St. Petersburg, lost to Lars Anderson December 15, 1977 Jacksonville, def. The Spoiler June 19, 1978 West Palm Beach, lost to the Spoiler September 23, 1978 Lakeland, def. Bob Roop in tournament final for vacant title November 25, 1978 St. Petersburg, lost to Mr. Uganda, Cyclone Negro, December 12, 1978 Tampa, def. King Curtis Aokia July 4, 1979 Miami Beach, title vacated when Rhodes won NWA World Heavyweight title, def. Bobby Jaggers October 26, 1980 Fort Lauderdale, lost to Dory Funk Jr. November 4, 1980 Tampa. NWA Georgia Heavyweight, def. The Spoiler January 30, 1976 Atlanta, lost to the Spoiler February 6, 1976 Atlanta. NWA Florida TV, def. Bobby Duncombe 1978, vacated title upon winning NWA World title, held title 1979. NWA Florida Tag Team, with Dick Murdoch, def. Jose Lothario and Argentina Apollo September 17, 1970 Jacksonville, title stripped December 1970, with Dick Slater, def. Mike Graham and Kevin Sullivan October 6, 1973 St. Petersburg, lost to Jose and Paul LeDuc November 22, 1973 Tampa, chosen by Mike Graham to be partner as champions after champions Graham and Dick Slater split up, Graham, def. Slater September 17, 1974 Tampa, lost to Dick Slater and Toru Tanaka October 1, 1974 Tampa, with Boba Brazil, def. Ivan Koloff and Nikolai Volkov August 1980, titles vacated, with Andre the Giant, def. Bobby Jaggers and R.T. Tyler, Randy Tyler, February 12, 1981 Gainesville, titles vacated. NWA United States Tag Team, Florida, with Bugsy McGraw, def. Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk July 4, 1980 Tampa in tournament final, vacated titles, with Blackjack Mulligan vs. Elijah Akeem, Leroy Brown, and Kareem Muhammad. Ray Candy November 5, 1983 Lakeland, lost to Ron Bass and One Man Gang November 22, 1983 Tampa. NWA Global Tag Team Florida, as Midnight Rider with Terry Allen Magnum TA, def. The Kangaroos, Don Kenton and Johnny Heffernan February 15, 1983 Tampa, gave his half of title to Scott McGee when Midnight Rider left area and Dusty Rhodes returned. NWA Florida Brass Knucks, def. Jose Lothario December 1, 1970 Tampa, stripped of title December 1970, held title December 1972, stripped of title in Angle December 1972 after argument with NWA President Sam Mushnick. NWA North American Heavyweight McGurk, def. Cowboy Bill Watts May 21, 1971 Shreveport, lost to Cowboy Bill Watts September 22, 1971 Jackson, Mississippi. NWA United States Tag Team, Tri-States Pre-Mid-South, with Andre the Giant, def. Ernie Ladd and Stan Hansen in tournament final for vacant title December 25, 1978 New Orleans, chose the Spoiler as partner after Andre left the territory, lost to the Assassin, Jody Hamilton, and the Angel, Frank Morrell, when Spoiler turned on Rhodes January 25, 1979 New Orleans. NWA North American Heavyweight, Hawaii, def. Sammy Steamboat November 25, 1972 Honolulu, lost to Billy Robinson June 6, 1973 Honolulu. NWA American Tag Team, with Baron Von Rasch, def. Jose Lothario and Tony Gonzalez August 18, 1969 Fort Worth, lost to Wahoo McDaniel and Thunderbolt Patterson August 25, 1969 Fort Worth. Rhodes teamed with Dick Murdoch in title loss as a sub for Von Rasch, with Dick Murdoch, def. Killer Carl Cox and Mike York December 1970, lost to Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, and George Scott December 15, 1970 Dallas. NWA Texas Brass Knucks, def. Mark Lewin January 7, 1979 Houston, lost to Mark Lewin January 28, 1979 Houston, def. Mark Lewin December 21, 1979 Houston, lost to Mark Lewin January 1980. NWA Central States Heavyweight, def. Tommy Martin, Leo Burke, December 13, 1968 St. Joseph, lost to Don Kent January 10, 1969 St. Joseph. NWA North American Tag Team, with Dick Murdoch, def. Terry Martin, Bobby Burke / Terry K., and Tommy Martin. Leo Burke, November 7, 1968 Kansas City, lost to Bob Geigel and the Viking December 27, 1968 Kansas City. NWA Bahama Islands Heavyweight Def. Angelo Mosca July 1983 Nassau, vacated title 1984 when leaving for Jim Crockett Promotions. PWF Heavyweight, Florida Championship Wrestling, Def. Big Steel Man, Fred Ottman / Tugboat, February 15, 1989 Tampa, lost to Big Steel Man May 13, 1989 Sarasota. NWA Mid-Atlantic Tag Team, with Buff Bagwell Def. Terry Taylor and Ricky Nelson January 22, 2005 Seoul, South Korea, vacated titles 2005. Wrestling Observer Awards. Best Babyface, 1980 Most Charismatic, 1982 Best Booker, 1986. Most Overrated 1987, 1988. Worst Feud of Year as Midnight Rider vs. Tully Blanchard 1988 Worst TV Announcer, 1997. WCW Hall of Fame, 1995 Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, 1996 WWE Hall of Fame, 2007 Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, 2010. June 29, 2015. In the Dusty Rhodes bio last week, we had his birthday as April 12, 1945, but it was October 12, 1945. What's amazing about that is that I've known his birthday without looking it up for at least 35 years. Also, the Jack Briscoe vs. Dusty Rhodes NWA title match in Miami Beach,